On June 14, 2019, Renata, Solís, and Cheyenne Briley left a campsite in the Big Cypress National Preserve and walked north along a trail neither of them had hiked before. They told Renata's cousin they'd be back by sundown. They were 20 and 22 years old, and they were not seen again for 731 days. When they were found, in a structure that didn't appear on any map, 38 miles from where they'd disappeared, Cheyenne was 7 months pregnant. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen the sky. But that comes later. First, there's the trail. First, there's the morning they left. First, there's the part where everything was still ordinary, and neither of them knew it wouldn't be for much longer. Renata Solís grew up in Hialeah, in a stucco house with a chain-link fence and a mango tree that dropped fruit onto the neighbor's car every August. Her mother, Windowless, worked nights at Baptist Hospital. Her father had gone back to Havana when Renata was 4, or that's what Windowless said. The truth was more complicated, as truths involving fathers tend to be. Renata was the kind of person who collected hobbies like other people collected grudges. She'd been through a ceramics phase, a distance-running phase, a phase where she read only books written before 1900. When she discovered backpacking in her sophomore year at FIU, it consumed her the way everything consumed her, totally, ravenously, with an enthusiasm that exhausted the people around her. She'd call me at midnight to tell me about some trail she'd found online, her roommate Danielle later said, like actual midnight, and she'd be so excited she was practically yelling. You couldn't be mad at her, though. That was Renata's thing. She made you want to care about whatever she cared about, even if you didn't. She was 20 years old, studying environmental science, 5'2" with her mother's dark hair and a gap between her front teeth that she refused to fix. It gives me character, she told Windowless whenever braces came up. Celebrities pay for this look. She did not sit still well. She talked with her hands. She sang in the shower, badly according to Danielle, who shared a wall. She was allergic to cats, but kept trying to befriend them anyway, her eyes swelling shut while she insisted the cat liked her. It definitely liked her. Look at how it was purring. She was alive in the way that certain people are alive, excessively, loudly, taking up slightly more space than their bodies require. Cheyenne Briley was the opposite frequency. She'd grown up in Davie, daughter of a farrier named Boyd Briley, who shod horses at the ranches that still dotted the western edges of Broward County. Cheyenne had her father's patience, his ability to stand in one place for hours doing careful, repetitive work without complaint. She was tall, 5'10", with sunburned arms and a braid that reached the middle of her back. She spoke softly, and only when she had something specific to say. She and Renata had met at a REI workshop on backcountry water filtration. They shouldn't have been friends. Renata's volume alone should have driven Cheyenne away within minutes. But there was something about the pairing that worked. Renata provided the energy. Cheyenne provided the calm. Together, they'd hiked sections of the Florida Trail, paddled through the 10,000 islands, camped in Ocala. This trip, a 4-day excursion into Big Cypress during the wet season's early edge, was supposed to be their most ambitious. Che was the one who planned things, Boyd Briley told investigators. Renata would say, "Let's go somewhere amazing," and Che would figure out where and how. She was the practical one. She packed the first aid kit. She checked the weather. He paused. Then he said, "She checked the weather 3 times before they left. She was careful. People keep asking me if they were reckless, if they did something wrong. They weren't. They didn't. My daughter was the most careful person I've ever known, and it didn't matter." Boyd was right. It didn't matter. Careful means nothing when the danger isn't weather or wildlife or terrain. Careful means nothing when the danger is a person. BCN's Big Cypress National Preserve covers over 700,000 acres of southern Florida. A vast, flat expanse of cypress swamps, hardwood hammocks, prairies of sawgrass, and pine islands rising just inches above the waterline. It is not the Everglades, though it borders them and feeds them, sharing the same sheet of slow-moving water that has been creeping south toward Florida Bay for millennia. The difference is subtle but important. The Everglades are a national park, managed, maintained, patrolled. Big Cypress is a national preserve, which means it operates under different rules. Hunting is permitted in season. Off-road vehicles carve trails through the muck. Private inholdings, parcels of land owned before the preserve was established in 1974, still dot the interior, some of them occupied, some abandoned, some in a state between the two that defies easy classification. This is land that resists human knowledge. You can study a map of Big Cypress for hours and still not understand it, because the map shows roads and trails and boundaries, and the reality is water. Water everywhere, sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes waist-deep, its depth changing with the rains, its surface broken by cypress knees and the slow wake of alligators and the thin legs of wading birds standing motionless in the shimmer. The air is heavy. Not metaphorically, physically heavy, saturated with moisture that coats your skin and fogs your sunglasses and makes every breath feel like you're drinking something. In June, the temperature holds in the low 90s and the humidity matches it, and the mosquitoes arrive in clouds so dense they register as a sound before a sight, a high, thin whine that never stops. People disappear in Big Cypress, not frequently, not in numbers that would make headlines, but with a regularity that rangers have learned to accept. Hikers wander off maintained trails and find themselves in waist-deep water with no landmarks. Hunters follow game into hammocks so dense that GPS signals fragment. The swamp takes things in and doesn't always give them back. Vehicles have been found mired in muck 100 yards from a paved road, their owners never located. The preserve is large enough and wild enough that a person could die a mile from a trailhead and not be found for years. Or they could be kept alive, 38 miles from a campground, in a place no one thought to look. Renata's cousin, Solís, had driven them to the campsite at Bear Island. He wasn't a hiker. He'd come along because his truck had the clearance to handle the unpaved access roads, and because Evelise had asked him to make sure the girls arrived safely. "I dropped them off around 9 in the morning," Marco told deputies. "They had their packs, they had their gear, they had a plan. Renata was talking 100 miles an hour about some bird she wanted to see. I don't remember which one. Cheyenne was studying the map. They seemed good, happy." He was supposed to pick them up 4 days later, on June 18th, from the same spot. When he arrived and they weren't there, he waited 2 hours. Then he called Renata's phone. No answer. He called Cheyenne's. No answer. He drove the access road twice, looking for any sign of them, then called Evelise, who called Boyd, who called the Collier County Sheriff's Office. It was June 18th, 2019, around 4 in the afternoon. The girls had last been seen 4 days earlier. The search began that evening. Deputy Harlan Fossey was the first responder, and later the lead liaison between the Sheriff's Office and the National Park Service. He was 46 years old, built like someone who'd been working outdoors his entire life, which he had, 12 years as a commercial fisherman in the Keys before joining the department. He knew swamp. He knew water. He knew how the Everglades ecosystem functioned, how the land breathed with the seasons, how the wet months transformed the preserve into something approaching impassable. "When I got the call, my first thought was water," Fossey said. "Mid-June, the rains are starting. Water levels come up fast, sometimes overnight. 2 hikers, backcountry, not super experienced in this specific terrain. My first assumption was they'd gotten turned around in rising water, maybe stranded on a hammock, maybe injured, maybe worse. Worse meant drowned." Fossey didn't say it, but it was what he meant. Drowning in Big Cypress doesn't look like drowning in a lake or a pool. The water is shallow, rarely more than chest deep on maintained trails, though off-trail it varies wildly. But the bottom is unstable. Limestone karst, solution holes, peat that gives way underfoot. A person can step from 6 inches of water into 6 feet of water without warning. Add a heavy pack, disorientation, exhaustion, and the math gets bad quickly. The initial search followed protocol. Park Service rangers and sheriff's deputies covered the maintained trails radiating from the Bear Island campground. A helicopter surveyed the surrounding area, looking for color, a tent, a pack, clothing. Search dogs were brought in, but the water complicated scent tracking. The dogs worked the trail for about 2 miles before losing the trail at a point where the path crossed a cypress strand, a linear swamp running east to west, cutting across the trail like a moat. "The dogs lost it right at the water," said the K-9 handler, Sergeant Nadine Prokop. "That's not unusual in this environment. Water disperses scent." But what struck me was how clean the loss was. Usually there's some residual scent on the other side. They came through. They continued. Here, it was like they walked into the water and just stopped existing. She paused, then added, I know how that sounds. But that's what the dogs were telling me. They entered the water and didn't come out. Not on any side. The first 72 hours of a missing person search are critical, and everyone involved knew it. By the end of day 3, the operation had expanded to include 40 searchers, 3 K-9 teams, an infrared-equipped helicopter, and a sonar unit, borrowed from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to scan deeper water. They found Renata's water bottle on the second day. It was a purple Nalgene with a FIU sticker on it, lying in palmetto scrub about a quarter-mile north of where the dogs had lost the scent. It was empty. The cap was on. That bothered me, Fossey said. If you're lost and dehydrated, you don't cap your empty water bottle and set it down neatly. You throw it, you drop it, you leave it wherever. This was placed, upright, cap on, like someone had put it there deliberately. The bottle was processed for fingerprints. Renata's were on it, as expected. There was a partial second set that couldn't be matched to Cheyenne. That's when my thinking started to shift, Fossey said. Lost hikers leave a trail, dropped gear, footprints, broken vegetation. They move in patterns. They make noise. They try to be found. Renata and Cheyenne left almost nothing. A water bottle, deliberately placed. That's not lost. That's something else. The search continued for 9 more days. Aerial surveys covered hundreds of square miles. Boats probed the deeper sloughs and cypress domes. Divers went into the larger solution holes, natural limestone sinkholes that can be 30 feet deep, their openings hidden beneath lily pads and duckweed. They found nothing. On June 30th, 2019, the active search was scaled back. The case was reclassified from search and rescue to missing persons. Renata Solís and Cheyenne Briley were entered into NAMIS, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, and their photographs were distributed to law enforcement agencies across southern Florida. The swamp kept its silence. Ivelisse Solís did not accept the reclassification. She could not accept it because accepting it meant accepting that her daughter might not be coming back, and Ivelisse had decided that was not an option. She was a small woman. Renata got her height from her, with the kind of composure that comes from decades of night shifts, of managing crises at 3 in the morning, of holding other people together when they were falling apart. She applied that composure to her daughter's disappearance with a discipline that awed and sometimes frightened the people around her. Within a week of the search being scaled back, Ivelisse had created a Facebook page, printed 3,000 flyers, organized a volunteer search team, and retained an attorney to pressure the sheriff's office into keeping the case active. She called Deputy Fossey every Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. She called the Park Service every Wednesday. She called the FBI on Fridays because she'd heard that federal land meant federal jurisdiction, and she wanted every possible agency looking for her daughter. I don't sleep anyway, she told a reporter from the Naples Daily News. I work nights, so now I work days too. I look for Renata during the day and I work at the hospital at night, and when people ask me how I'm holding up, I say I'm fine, because what else am I going to say? That I'm not? That's not going to bring her home. She paused, and something shifted in her face, just briefly, like a crack in plaster that seals itself before you can trace it. My daughter's alive, she said. I know that the way I know my own heartbeat. She is alive somewhere, and she is waiting for someone to find her, and I will not stop until someone does. Boyd Briley handled his daughter's disappearance differently. He continued shoeing horses. He drove to ranches, unloaded his anvil and tools, bent iron over a forge, fitted shoes to hooves. His hands, thick and scarred from 30 years of farrier work, did the same motions they'd always done. People expected me to fall apart, he said. I couldn't afford to. I've got horses that need shoes whether my daughter's missing or not. The animals don't know. They don't care. They just need their feet done. Then he said, the work is the only time my hands stop shaking. Boyd did not make Facebook pages or call deputies on a schedule. He went to the preserve every weekend, alone, with a machete and a GPS unit and a photograph of Cheyenne in a plastic bag in his shirt pocket. He walked into the swamp at dawn and came out at dark, methodically covering ground, marking what he'd searched, moving on to the next section. He did this every weekend for 2 years, 104 trips into the preserve. He estimates he covered 300 square miles on foot, in water that was sometimes ankle-deep and sometimes armpit-deep, in heat that left him dizzy, through clouds of mosquitoes that left his arms swollen and raw. He never found anything, but he never stopped. Someone asked me once if it was pointless, he said, walking around in a swamp looking for someone who might not be there. And I told them, I shoe horses for a living. I know what it looks like when something's pointless. You put a shoe on a horse, and 6 weeks later it wears out and you do it again. That's pointless. But you do it because the horse needs it. My daughter needed me to keep looking. Even if she didn't know I was looking, even if she couldn't know, she needed someone to not give up. He was right. She did need that, though she couldn't know it. The months that followed were defined by absence of leads, of evidence, of progress. The case remained open, but effectively stalled. Fossey worked it when he could, between active caseloads that demanded his time. He ran the unidentified fingerprints through AFIS, the national database. No match. He interviewed park visitors who'd been at Bear Island around the same date. None had seen anything unusual. He requested cell tower records for Renata's and Cheyenne's phones, but the coverage in Big Cypress is sparse to non-existent. There are simply no towers in most of the preserve's interior, and the last recorded pings had placed both phones near the campground on the morning of June 14th. After that, silence. Cases like this in this kind of terrain, they go one of two ways, Fossey said. Either you find something early, some piece of physical evidence that gives you a direction, or you don't find anything and the landscape just absorbs it. The swamp is a better crime scene cleaner than any human could be. It eats evidence. Decomposition is accelerated. Scavengers are everywhere. Water moves things. A year out, there might not be anything left to find. He was speaking about bodies. The assumption, increasingly, was that Renata and Cheyenne were dead, drowned or lost, their remains scattered by the ecosystem that reclaims everything eventually. The evidence pointed that way. The absence of evidence pointed that way. But Fossey kept returning to the water bottle. Purple Nalgene, cap on, upright. Things that are dropped don't land that way, he said. Things that are placed land that way, and things that are placed by a lost, dehydrated hiker don't make sense. You don't carefully set down your empty water bottle while you're dying of thirst. He also returned to the K9 results, the clean scent loss at the water crossing. Prokop told me the dogs said they went in and didn't come out. I keep thinking about that. What if someone carried them? Carried the scent, I mean. You pick someone up, you put them in a vehicle, an airboat, a swamp buggy, an ATV, and you move them through water, and the dogs lose it. The scent goes where the vehicle goes, not where the trail goes. It was a theory. Just a theory. He couldn't prove it. He had no suspects, no motive, no evidence of foul play beyond a carefully placed water bottle and a clean scent loss. In a landscape that routinely swallowed experienced hunters and fishermen, the simplest explanation was still the likeliest. But Fossey couldn't let go of the bottle, of the way the dogs had simply stopped, confused, at the edge of the water. I told my wife once that I was probably wrong, he said, that they probably drowned, and I was seeing patterns that weren't there because I wanted the case to be solvable. She asked me what my gut said. I told her my gut said someone took those girls out of the water on a vehicle. She asked who. I said I didn't know. She asked where. I said I didn't know that either. He shook his head. She told me to keep pulling on the thread anyway. So I did. The thread Fossey pulled led him, slowly and indirectly, to the subject of inholdings. Big Cypress National Preserve was established in 1974, but the government didn't purchase all the land at once. Private landowners within the preserve's boundaries were given options: sell immediately, retain a life estate, or negotiate long-term agreements. The result was a patchwork of public and private land that persists to this day. Dozens of parcels, some tiny, some spanning hundreds of acres, scattered throughout the preserve's interior. Some are accessible only by unpaved roads or airboat trails. Some are accessible only by water. Most inholders are hunters, fishermen, or descendants of the original owners, people who've lived in or near the swamp for generations and have no intention of leaving. They maintain camps, cabins, and occasionally more substantial structures. They operate largely outside the sight of park rangers, not because they're hiding, but because the preserve is simply too large to monitor comprehensively. I started looking at the inholdings because of the vehicle theory, Fossey said. If someone moved those girls by airboat or swamp buggy, they needed somewhere to go, not a public campground, not a ranger station, somewhere private, somewhere off the grid. The inholdings were the obvious answer. There were 67 active inholding agreements within Big Cypress as of 2019. Fossey began the slow process of identifying each property owner and cross-referencing them against criminal databases. Most were unremarkable. Families who'd owned land for decades, seasonal hunters, a few commercial fishing operations. One name surfaced that Fossey couldn't resolve. A 640-acre parcel in the southeastern interior of the preserve, accessible only by a series of unpaved roads and a final 3-mile stretch of airboat trail, was owned by a trust called Sweetwater Holdings LLC. The trust had been established in 1991. The property taxes, paid on time every year, were remitted from a P.O. box in Immokalee. I couldn't figure out who was behind the trust, Fossey said. The registered agent was a lawyer in Fort Myers who died in 2008. The successor agent was another LLC. It was layered, not impenetrably, but more than you'd expect for a hunting camp in the swamp. Fossey requested a welfare check on the property. A park ranger conducted a flyover in August of 2019 and reported seeing a structure, a cabin or large shed, a dock, and what appeared to be a functional airboat. The property appeared maintained. No people were visible. The ranger noted one other detail in his report, almost as an afterthought. The structure had no visible windows. Foss read that detail, then read it again. Then he set the report aside and pulled up the Sweetwater Holdings filing documents, looking for any name, any signature, any connection to a real person. It would take him 7 more months to find one. In that time, Solís continued calling every Monday at 8. Boyd Briley continued walking into the swamp every weekend with his machete and his photograph. And somewhere in the interior of Big Cypress, in a windowless structure on 640 acres of private land, 2 young women existed in conditions that no report or document or testimony would ever fully convey. The water bottle sat in an evidence bag in Fossey's office. Purple Nalgene, FIU sticker, cap on. He looked at it every morning when he sat down at his desk. It looked back at him. "That bottle knew something," he said. "I know that sounds crazy, but it was trying to tell me something, and I just couldn't hear it yet." 14 months into the investigation, in August of 2020, Fossey received a response to a records request he'd nearly forgotten he'd filed. The Collier County Property Appraiser's Office had located the original deed transfer for the Sweetwater Holdings parcel, a 1991 transaction that predated digital records and had required a physical search of paper files in a storage facility in East Naples. The seller had been a cattle rancher named Ulysses Grady, who died in 1989. His estate had sold the parcel to Sweetwater Holdings for $42,000. The signature on the purchasing documents belonged to the trust's original registered agent, the deceased Fort Myers attorney. But there was a second signature, a witness, required by Florida law for deed transfers at the time. The witness had signed his name in a tight, careful hand, Odell Prentice. Fossey ran the name. Odell Garner Prentice, born 1961, Immokalee, Florida. He had a driver's license, a vehicle registration, a 2004 Ford F-250, and a concealed carry permit. His listed address was a rural route outside Immokalee. He had no criminal record, no warrants, no flags of any kind. He was a nobody, a name on a document from 1991. Fossey almost moved on. There were 66 other inholdings to investigate, but something about the name snagged him, not the name itself, which was ordinary, forgettable, the kind of name that disappears into paperwork. It was the address. The rural route outside Immokalee was less than 15 miles from the southern border of Big Cypress, and from the unpaved roads that accessed the Sweetwater Holdings parcel. Fossey pulled Prentice's vehicle registration history. The 2004 Ford was his current vehicle. Before that, a 1997 Chevy Silverado. Before that, a 1988 Ford Bronco. All trucks, all utilitarian. He also owned a registered watercraft, a 2010 Diamondback airboat with a 500 horsepower engine. Fossey sat with that for a long time. An airboat, capable of moving through the shallow waters of the preserve at speeds that would leave no footprints, no tire tracks, no scent trail for dogs to follow, capable of reaching a windowless structure on 640 acres of private land, capable of carrying two people who didn't want to go. It was still a theory, still circumstantial. A name on a 28-year-old deed, an airboat registration, an address near the preserve. Nothing that would justify a warrant, nothing that would hold up in court, nothing that proved anything beyond the fact that a man named Odell Prentice had some connection to a piece of property in the swamp. But Fossey had learned something in his years of police work, something that couldn't be taught at the academy and couldn't be explained in a report. The feeling of a thread that leads somewhere. Not certainty, not evidence, just the particular tension of something that is about to become important. He opened a new file on his computer and typed the name at the top. Prentice, Odell G. Then he began the slow, methodical work of learning everything there was to know about a man the world had never noticed. He didn't know it yet, but he was 8 months from the door of a windowless building, and from what he would find inside it, the thing that would end the search and begin something worse. The thing that would make him wish for just a moment that the swamp had kept its secrets. Odell Prentice had lived his entire life within a 30-mile radius of Immokalee, and he had done it so quietly that learning about him felt less like investigating a person and more like excavating a fossil, brushing away layers of nothing to find the faint impression of something that had once been there. He had been born to Garner and Lucille Prentice in a cinder block house on the edge of town. Garner worked seasonal agriculture, citrus, tomatoes, whatever was being picked, and drank the rest of the year. Lucille cleaned houses for the ranching families east of town until her back gave out in 1978, after which she cleaned nothing, including herself. Odell was their only child, a fact that neighbors attributed to intention, but that Lucille, in a rare moment of candor, once attributed to luck. He was a quiet boy, said Marguerite Odom, who'd lived 2 houses down from the Prentice family until 1985. Not shy, exactly. Shy kids want to talk but can't. Odell just didn't seem interested. Like the rest of us weren't quite real to him. Like we were on television and he was watching. He attended Immokalee High School, where he earned unremarkable grades, played no sports, joined no clubs, and left no impression on any teacher Fossey could locate. He graduated in 1979 and went to work for a fencing company that served the cattle ranches south of Lake Okeechobee. He was good with his hands. He was dependable. He showed up on time. His employers, when Fossey tracked them down, described him in terms so generic they could have been describing a piece of equipment. Reliable, functional, no problems. He never married. He had no children anyone knew of. He attended no church. He belonged to no organizations. He had no social media presence, no email address that Fossey could find, no digital footprint beyond his vehicle registrations and tax payments. The guy was a ghost, Fossey said, not in a suspicious way, or at least not in a way that would seem suspicious until you already suspected something. He was just absent from everything, like he'd opted out of being a person anyone would remember. Foss found one photograph of Odell Prentice from a 2003 group shot of employees at a fence supply company in LaBelle. Prentice stood at the far left edge of the frame, slightly apart from the others. He was a lean man, weathered with a narrow face and deep-set eyes that looked past the camera rather than into it. He wore a khaki work shirt and a cap with no logo. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't not smiling. His expression was simply vacant, a face at rest, unbothered by the fact of being seen, undisturbed by anything at all. Fossey showed the photograph to Sergeant Prokop, the K-9 handler. "That's the face of a man who's never been surprised by himself," she said. "You know what I mean? Most people, even the worst ones, have a moment where they look in the mirror and don't recognize what they've become. This guy, I don't think he ever had that moment. I think he always knew exactly what he was. In March of 2021, Fossey had enough to request a warrant, not for arrest but for a welfare check and property inspection of the Sweetwater Holdings parcel. The legal basis was thin: an unresolved missing persons case, a property with no visible windows, an airboat owner with a connection to the land. The judge, a circuit court veteran named Renata Vega, read the petition twice before signing it. She later told a colleague that the detail about the windows was what decided her. "No windows," she said. "A structure in the middle of a swamp with no windows. There's only one reason to build something like that." The operation was planned for April 5, 2021. Fossey coordinated with the Park Service, the Collier County Sheriff's SWAT unit, and a medical team from the NCH healthcare system in Naples. He didn't know what he'd find. He planned for every possibility, including the one where the structure was empty and Prentice was simply a recluse who liked his privacy and his dark rooms. He didn't believe that possibility, but he planned for it. The team launched from a staging area on Turner River Road at 4:30 a.m. 3 airboats, running without headlights to avoid detection, carrying 14 officers and 2 paramedics. The morning was moonless. The swamp was black. Not dark, but black, the kind of darkness that has texture, that presses against your face. The only sounds were the hiss of the boats through sawgrass and the occasional startled flush of a bird roosting in the cypress. They reached the property at 5:47 a.m. The dock was there, as the flyover had described. The airboat, Prentice's Diamondback, was tied to it. Beyond the dock, a footpath of crushed limestone led through a stand of pond cypress and ended at the structure. It was larger than the aerial photographs had suggested. Concrete block construction, approximately 40 by 60 feet, with a corrugated metal roof and a single steel door on the south-facing wall. No windows. A diesel generator sat under a corrugated lean-to on the east side, humming. Power lines ran from the generator into the building through a conduit. The generator was running. At 5:47 in the morning. Someone was inside. Fossey gave the signal. SWAT breached the door. What they found required 3 separate reports to document because no single narrative could contain it. The structure was divided into sections. The first, immediately inside the door, served as a living area. A cot, a camp stove, a shelf of canned food, a battery-powered radio tuned to no station. This was where Prentice slept, ate, existed. It was orderly in the way of a man who has organized his life down to its minimum components, everything in its place, nothing unnecessary, nothing personal, no photographs, no books, no decoration of any kind. The second section was separated from the first by a wall of plywood and 2x4s, with a door secured by 3 padlocks. Behind it was a corridor, approximately 4 feet wide and 20 feet long, lit by a single fluorescent tube that buzzed and flickered. On either side of the corridor were 2 rooms. Each had a door with a deadbolt that locked from the outside. Each had a cot, a bucket, and a length of chain bolted to the concrete floor. Renata Solís was in the room on the left. Cheyenne Briley was in the room on the right. They were alive. The SWAT team leader, a deputy named Colton Weeks, was the first through the corridor. He unlocked Renata's door because it was closest. Later, in his written report, he described what he saw in language that was precise and controlled and utterly insufficient. The room contained a white female, later identified as Renata Solís, seated on a cot against the far wall. She was shackled at the left ankle by a chain approximately 6 feet in length, bolted to the floor. She was conscious and responsive. Upon seeing me, she raised her hands to shield her eyes from my flashlight. She said, "Is this real?" He turned off his flashlight. He identified himself. He told her she was safe, that they were police, that they were going to take her home. She didn't move. She sat on the cot with her hands still raised as if the light were still in her eyes, and she said, "Where's Cheyenne? Is Cheyenne here? Don't leave without Cheyenne." She hadn't seen Cheyenne in what she estimated was 3 months. The wall between their rooms was concrete block. They had communicated by knocking, patterns they'd developed, a code of taps that meant, "I'm here and I'm okay and don't give up." Cheyenne was in the other room. She was 7 months pregnant. She could not stand without assistance. She had not seen sunlight, had not seen any natural light, in what forensic psychologists would later estimate was the entire duration of her captivity. 731 days without the sky. When Deputy Weeks opened her door, Cheyenne did not speak. She looked at him, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who has forgotten that rescue is a thing that can happen, not hopeless exactly, but something beyond hope, something that has moved past the place where hope and despair are distinguishable from each other. Then she heard Renata's voice in the corridor, Renata shouting now. That enormous, ravenous voice that had once kept Danielle awake past midnight, talking about trails, shouting Cheyenne's name. And Cheyenne Briley put her face in her hands and made a sound that Weeks did not attempt to describe in his report. He wrote only, "The victim became emotional upon hearing the voice of Renata Solís." Some things are beyond the reach of incident reports. Odell Prentice was not in the structure. He was found 40 minutes later, a quarter-mile south, sitting in a lawn chair at the edge of a cypress dome, drinking coffee from a thermos. He did not run. He did not resist. He watched the deputies approach across the shallow water with an expression that Fossey, who was among them, later struggled to articulate. "It wasn't surprise," Fossey said. "It wasn't fear. It was, I want to say, disappointment, like a man whose project has been interrupted, like we'd knocked over something he was building." Prentice was arrested without incident. He set down his coffee, stood up, and extended his wrists. "He said one thing to me," Fossey recalled. "While I was cuffing him, he said, 'They were fine. I took care of them.' Like he expected me to agree. Like he was waiting for me to say, 'Oh, okay then.'" Fossey did not say that. Fossey said nothing at all, because he was thinking about the chain bolted to the floor and the bucket in the corner and the fluorescent tube buzzing in a corridor with no windows, and he did not trust himself to speak. The investigation that followed would take 11 months and fill over 4,000 pages of documentation. Prentice, once in custody, spoke freely, not out of remorse, but out of what the interviewing psychologist described as a compulsive need to be understood. He had watched Renata and Cheyenne from the moment they arrived at Bear Island. He'd been at the campground that morning, in his truck, ostensibly checking a fence line on an adjacent parcel. He saw 2 young women with backpacks. He noted which trail they took. He returned to his property, retrieved his airboat, and positioned himself at the Cypress Strand crossing, the exact point where the dogs would later lose the scent. He'd waited in the water, in the sawgrass, invisible. When they waded into the crossing, he emerged behind them. He had a gun, a .357 revolver that he'd owned for 20 years and never fired at a person before. "I didn't need to use it," he said. "I showed it. That was enough." He loaded them onto the airboat. He took their phones and dropped them in the water near the campground, the last ping Fossey had recorded. He transported them 38 miles through the interior of the preserve to the structure he'd built over the course of 6 years, starting in 2013. Concrete block by concrete block, he'd mixed the mortar himself. When asked why, the question that every investigator, every psychologist, every journalist would eventually ask, Prentice was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wanted to keep something." The psychologist waited. "Everything out here disappears," Prentice continued. "The water takes it, the swamp takes it, nothing stays. I wanted something that stayed." He spoke about Renata and Cheyenne the way Boyd Briley spoke about horses, as things that required maintenance, routine, care. He fed them. He provided water. He ran the generator so they had light. He spoke to them daily, though he could not recall what he'd said. "Just talking," he told the psychologist. "You know, about the day." He did not acknowledge that they were prisoners. He did not acknowledge the chains, the locked doors, the absence of windows. When the psychologist pointed these things out, Prentice looked confused, the same genuine confusion that characterized his entire confession, and said, "I had to keep them safe. There are animals out there, alligators, panthers. You can't just let people wander around." The psychologist's assessment, filed with the state attorney, included a line that Fossey later said he'd never forget. Mr. Prentice does not appear to distinguish between captivity and protection. In his framework, the removal of another person's freedom is indistinguishable from the provision of safety. He perceives himself not as a captor, but as a custodian. When asked about the pregnancy, Prentice said nothing. For the first time in 14 hours of interviews, he refused to speak. His attorney requested a break. The interview did not resume on that topic. Renata and Cheyenne were transported to NCH Baker Hospital in Naples. Their physical conditions were severe but survivable. Malnutrition, muscle atrophy, vitamin D deficiency so profound that Renata's bones had begun to soften. Cheyenne's pregnancy was high risk due to her physical state, but the baby, a girl, was delivered healthy on June 2, 2021, 7 weeks after the rescue. Cheyenne named her Luz. The word in Spanish means light. Boyd Briley drove to the hospital the morning of the rescue. He arrived before the ambulance did. He stood in the parking lot in his work clothes, the leather apron he wore for shoeing, because he'd left a ranch mid-appointment when the call came. And he waited. When the ambulance doors opened and he saw his daughter on the gurney, alive, blinking against the Florida sun, he dropped to his knees on the asphalt. Not in collapse, in something else, something that doesn't have a word, because the language wasn't built for the moment when 2 years of walking into a swamp with a machete and a photograph finally lead somewhere. He couldn't speak. Cheyenne reached out from the gurney and touched his hand, and he held it, and they stayed like that while the paramedics worked around them, neither of them saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the grip of their hands wasn't already saying. Ivelisse Solís arrived 20 minutes later. She walked into the hospital room where Renata was being examined, and she looked at her daughter, and she said, "I told them you were alive. That was all." She sat down beside the bed and took Renata's hand and did not let go for 7 hours. Odell Prentice was charged with 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of aggravated battery, 2 counts of false imprisonment, and 1 count of sexual battery. He pleaded not guilty. His trial, delayed by pandemic-related court backlogs, concluded in November of 2022. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, he was offered the opportunity to address the court. He declined. Renata spoke. She stood at the podium in a courtroom in Naples, 5'2", gap between her teeth, and she looked directly at Prentice, who did not look back, and she said, "You told us you were keeping us safe. You said that every day, every single day for 2 years, you unlocked the door and brought food and said, 'I'm keeping you safe.' And the worst part isn't that you believed it. The worst part is that after a while, I started to believe it too. I started to think the chain was normal. I started to think the dark was normal. I forgot what rain sounded like. I forgot what my mother's voice sounded like on a phone instead of in my memory." She paused. "You didn't keep me safe. You kept me. There's a difference, and you will never understand it, and I will spend the rest of my life understanding it too well." Cheyenne did not speak at sentencing. Boyd read a statement on her behalf. His hands shook so badly that the judge offered to have a clerk read it instead. Boyd declined. "My daughter wants the court to know that she is alive," he read. "She wants the court to know that Luz is healthy. She wants the court to know that she has seen the sky every day since April 5th, and she intends to keep seeing it." He folded the paper. He put it in his shirt pocket, the same pocket where he'd carried her photograph for 2 years. He walked out of the courtroom and drove to a ranch in Hendry County where a horse was waiting to be shod. The horse needed its feet done. The work continued. The structure in Big Cypress was demolished in February of 2023. A Park Service crew dismantled it block by block and hauled the debris out by barge. The concrete pad remains, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. In 5 years, maybe 10, the swamp will cover it entirely. The cypress will grow over it. The water will rise and fall with the seasons, indifferent to what happened there, as water always is. Renata returned to FIU. She changed her major from environmental science to social work. She does not hike anymore. She does not go to REI. She lives in an apartment in Miami with windows on every wall, and she leaves the blinds open always, even at night. People ask if I'm afraid of the dark, she told an interviewer. I'm not afraid of it. I just don't want to volunteer for it. Cheyenne lives with her father and Davy. She works part-time at a feed store. Luz is 3 years old now, and she has her mother's braid and her mother's quietness and a laugh that Boyd says sounds exactly like Cheyenne's did at that age, sudden and rare and worth waiting for. Cheyenne still doesn't talk much about what happened. She may never. The parts that can be spoken have been spoken in courtrooms and depositions, and the rest belongs to her, and she is under no obligation to share it. But Boyd says that on clear nights, Cheyenne takes Luz into the backyard and they lie on a blanket and look at the stars. She points out constellations she's learned from a book: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Southern Cross. Luz doesn't understand yet. She's 3. She grabs at the sky like she might catch something. Cheyenne lets her try. She's teaching her that it's there, Boyd said. The sky. She's teaching her to look up. That might sound simple. For Che, it isn't. Deputy Fossey still works for the Collier County Sheriff's Office. The purple Nalgene bottle is no longer on his desk. He returned it to Renata, who keeps it on a shelf in her apartment. She hasn't used it. She doesn't intend to. It's not a souvenir, she said. It's a reminder that I was there, that someone found it, that it mattered. Ivelisse still calls the sheriff's office on Monday mornings. Not about Renata. Renata is home. Renata is safe. Renata is alive in that excessive, loud, space-consuming way she's always been alive. Ivelisse calls because she's joined a volunteer network for families of missing persons. She calls on behalf of other mothers now, other daughters, other names in the NAMIS database. I got mine back, she says. Not everyone does, so I keep calling. Somebody has to keep calling. The swamp remains. 700,000 acres of water and cypress and sawgrass, breathing with the seasons, swallowing what it swallows, giving back what it chooses. It is not malevolent. It is not kind. It simply is, a landscape so vast and so indifferent that a person can vanish inside it for 2 years, 38 miles from where they disappeared, and the land itself notices nothing. The danger was never the swamp. The danger sat in a lawn chair, drinking coffee, watching the cypress, believing himself a keeper of things. The sky above Big Cypress is enormous, wider and deeper than anywhere else in Florida, unbroken by buildings or mountains, stretching in every direction until it meets the flat horizon and just keeps going. On clear nights, you can see more stars there than almost anywhere else east of the Mississippi. The darkness, for once, is a gift. It lets the light through. Cheyenne knows this now. She lies on a blanket in a backyard in Davie and watches her daughter reach for constellations, and she breathes. And she is here, under a sky she once forgot existed. Some mornings, before Luz wakes up, Cheyenne stands at the window and watches the sun come up. She doesn't do anything. She just watches. Boyd has seen her do this. He doesn't interrupt. He knows what she's doing. She's counting. One more sunrise, one more day with the sky. She intends to keep counting.